Okay, Mr. Phobes here. This will be the first mini lesson of two about the chromatic transparency project. Um, what I'm going to do here is introduce you to the theory, the color theory behind the project, and not so much the design. But what we're going to do is create something called chromatic transparency, and that is what is known as apparent transparency of color. Um, this is accomplished by color mixings rather than creating thin translucent layers of pigment. It's an illusion. That's why it's called apparent transparent. It's apparently transparent. So all these hues that you see are at their highest opacity. Um, the illusion is created by the color mixing, and we're going to talk about how to do that. It's isotope image and meaning. We'll talk more about that in uh, the next mini lesson. Um, what it will involve is using a split complement harmony and an analogous harmony. And if you read the readings in your book, this will help supplement this. Um, Transparency is a visual quality in which a distant image or element can be seen through a nearer one. So if you think about transparent films, the way they look one over another, um, that's the idea of transparency. We can actually see through them. But again, we're going to do this through color mixing and through 100% opacity. So here's a piece that I did several years ago using colored duct tape. So the tape is not painted, it's actual color. And the area that really shows this chromatic transparency is this area right in here. It looks like there's a yellow plane, like maybe a yellow glass plane over this whole area. And you can see where it is over the red, it appears to be orange, and where it's over the blue, it appears to be green. And that is because of the different rules about color mixing. But again, all of these hues are solid colors. They're not actually transparent or opacity. Okay, so here's a couple of things that we can talk about. When we have this illusion and we have one color passing over another, the result is a third color. So if we have the magenta over the blue, what happens is we get this violet in between. It can also be seen very clearly in achromatic transparency if you have a gray and black. When they pass through one another, you get this darker gray. This is known as a median, MEDIAN transparency. It's halfway, and that's the most effective way of doing it. As we work on this, we'll see how you can make transparencies that are not necessarily median, but maybe biased towards one color or another. Um, we could have done this so this hue here was biased more towards the dark blue or biased more towards the magenta, and they would have yield different results. Right now they look like there's really no difference between them. Um, it may be biased a little bit more towards the median, and it looks like this uh, strip is on top. Here's just the theory that happens. We're going to be using tints, tones, and shades. And so if we take a pure blue and mix it with a tint of red violet or red magenta, we get a tint of violet. And that's something that we're going to be seeing in this study. We're going to be seeing the results of color mixings, and we're going to be seeing different tints, tones, and shades. All right, here's the analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel and are dominated by a short range of hue. For our project, we're going to stick to colors that share only two primaries. So for example, even though green, yellow, and orange are next to each other, they would actually share all three primaries because we have blue and yellow here, yellow, and then red and orange. Not that these don't make interesting combinations, but we can start running into problems with our analogous study when we start doing this. Um, Here's the analogous in CMY, and CMY is what we're going to be working in. Again, it's a very short range. So if you start from a primary, you can go to an intermediate and a secondary, or we could have gone the other way. There's a varieties, but they're usually three, maybe four colors next to each other, but they certainly wouldn't go from a primary to a primary. Here's another tape painting that I did a few years back that's an analogous painting. So I've got a red, orange, and yellow, and when they mix, they apparently create orange. Split complements. This is the one that's a little bit harder for students initially to get. It's a color, and then you go to its complement and the color on either side. So there are three hues. Here's an example of our color wheel that we're going to be using. So this is maybe a little bit more clear. If we start with cyan and then we look at the complement red, the colors that are used in the triad are orange and red magenta. And these three make up the triad of the split complement. So again, it's the hue, and then you go to the hue the opposite, which is not included in the triad, and then it's the colors on either side. And again, in this color wheel, we are using the hues that are marked with the circles. We wouldn't go on just on either side of the red. Those hues are much too close together. So here's a diagram showing some mixings. If we start with the red, magenta, and the orange in our cyan, here you are, you can see it set up here, and you start mixing them together, you get interesting combinations. One of the things that's really interesting about this is if you take the orange and the red magenta together, you're going to get red, and you'll see that that creates the complement. So we know that the rule is that to make intermediates, you mix a primary a primary and a secondary together. That gives you an intermediate. But here's something that's also kind of interesting is if you mix two intermediates together, you will get a secondary. It's sort of an unusual way to get a secondary, but you can see that that would happen. Okay, let's look at the hues that we're going to use for a study and how this would work. So we'll be doing studies with these wheels, and I'm going to show you there's another video in the video tutorials on how to do this. We're going to do this in class, but let's say we start with our purely prismatics. Now you could do that in the split complementary study because the hues are far enough apart that you're going to get some differentiation between them. But we're going to talk about how to extend the value range by adding white and black to these. But you can see here's the theory. If you take your cyan, and then we've already looked at the complement is red. So if you have the split complement hues of orange and red magenta, when they mix, it's going to mix red. When you mix the cyan and red magenta together, you're going to get not violet, but something close to it. And it's a mixture of the red, magenta, and cyan. Now, when you mix the orange and the cyan together, you're going to get something relatively desaturated because the cyan is close to being complementary to the orange. So you're going to get this kind of desaturated cyan green. And the reason it's not pure cyan green is this would need to be pure yellow and cyan. So there's a little bit of red in here, so that desaturates that cyan green a little bit. When we mix all three together, we get a very close to a neutral gray, and we can look at the color sliders when we're working on how that works. Now, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to pick an analogous system to use the other study, and it could be It could be from these hues or it could be any analogous hues. We'll talk about how that works together in your study. Um, but one of the things you need to do, so let's say, so orange, red, and magenta are in fact analogous. But look, if you started mixing them all together uh, and you use them at their prismatic, they'd get very, very close together. So what we want to do is think about having one very, very light value, one medium value, and one dark value. So the way to do that is to start with our lightest value and add white, which would give us a tint. We can stay at our prismatic for the red magenta, but for the red we're going to add black, which is a shade. Now, look what's happened. So if we now mix the red, which has a shade in it, with the orange, which has white in it, it's going to make a tone because the tone is made up of gray. So our median mixing between the red and the orange is going to be this kind of desaturated tone. When we mix a prismatic with a hue that has white in it, it's going to create a tint. And then when we mix a prismatic with the black in it, it's going to create a shade. What do you think all three of these are going to be if we mix a tint, shade, and tone together? What do you think that's going to create? That's the basic theory behind this. The next mini lesson will be on how to set this up, and I'll talk about setting the design up in the next one. So that's basically it. What you need to retain from this is the theory of what are analogous colors, what are split complementary colors, and then the mixings that create tints, tones, and shades. That's it.